Hello, everyone. I'm Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair here at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. And it's a great pleasure today to be with Richard Fontaine and Ambassador Bob Blackwill, who have written a great new book called The Lost Decade. But we're going to jump especially toward the future and talk about the next pivot to Asia, because this book really is a duality of two things in my view. One, it's a great analysis of post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy, looking at 5 administrations up to the current administration. And then it's also a strategy book, a strategy that focuses particularly on this question of, has the United States acted with enough alacrity, urgency, and focus to create a pivot to Asia? And it hasn't, hence the lost decade. Why didn't it? And what does it need to do? So these are the questions that are in this great book. And I want to, just after I introduce the two speakers very briefly, turn to Ambassador Blackwill and then to Richard Fontaine to talk about, first, the failure of the pivot, and then secondly, we'll end up talking more about the next pivot to Asia. Ambassador Robert Blackwill is the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Planning under President George W. Bush. He was Presidential Envoy to Iraq. He was U.S. Ambassador to India. And he has a career of great achievements in writing throughout his years. Richard Fontaine, my former colleague at the Center for New American Security and boss, the Chief Executive Officer of CNAS. He has been Foreign Policy Advisor to the late Senator John McCain and worked at the State Department, the National Security Council, the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and is otherwise just an incredible workaholic who gets so much done on foreign policy and on strategy issues. So terrifically poised to write this important book. So if we could just start, Ambassador Blackwill, with you to maybe just begin by explaining what do you mean by the lost decade, and was it really the lost post-Cold War period, really more than even the last decade, that failed to pivot to Asia?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us. I think it's perhaps best to begin with what was the pivot and what did the Obama, Hillary Clinton administration have in mind. And it was really an extraordinary change in U.S. grand strategy, which throughout its history, the United States has been a Europe first nation. And now the Secretary of State announced in a foreign policy 5,000 plus word essay that Asia would be America's first external priority, with first claim on U.S. resources and attention. Richard and I believe, and we make clear in the book, that we think this was a strategically correct alteration in American grand strategy in 2011. But the problem is it never happened. We have over 1,000 footnotes in the book with citations in each of them. And I think we prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that neither in diplomacy, nor in economics, nor in military matters did such a pivot take place. And indeed, because no such pivot took place, and because simultaneously there has been what we call the astonishing rise of Chinese power, we end the 2010s in a much weaker position in Asia than when Hillary Clinton wrote her article.
Well, that crystallizes the dispute pretty well. And indeed, the book is most half footnotes. with 14 very crisply written chapters, I think. But Richard, over to you in terms of what are the reasons for the failure?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us. I can't believe that you referred to me as a workaholic because Patrick Cronin's contributions to policy, to strategy, to scholarship, and to service, public service, both in the military and others, are extraordinary. And I haven't seen a workaholic like Patrick Cronin. So thank you for everything that you continue to do in the field of security in Asia and more broadly. There were specific reasons why the pivot didn't accomplish all it set out to do. And one of the striking things is none of those reasons really include anyone thinking it was a bad idea. There wasn't some big opposition that said, no, actually Europe should be first after all, or whatever. So look at each of the domains, military, economic, and diplomacy. In the military sphere, there was an attempt to reap some kind of peace dividend from the drawing down of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and perhaps to shift some resources toward Asia. But of course, the wars didn't end. The war in Afghanistan went on for another decade. At the end of 2011, the U.S. did withdraw all of its troops from Iraq, but then went back in even bigger numbers in 2015 to fight off ISIS for 5 years. On top of that, you had the Budget Control Act that imposed sequestration, a big $500 billion cut to the defense budget. So you had both a shrinking pie of defense resources and not much a bigger slice for Asia. On the economic side, TPP was the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, was the centerpiece of the economic pivot. Lots of enthusiasm for that, and in fact, it came across the finish line, big, ambitious pan-regional trade agreement that included both the US and Japan. By 2016, when the administration moved to get approval by Congress, it was caught up in presidential politics. Both candidates on both sides, the last 4 candidates, Republican and Democrat, including Secretary Clinton, all came out against it. Of course, President Trump came in and withdrew the United States from TPP. And then on the diplomacy side, you saw a big spike in Asian diplomacy under Secretary Clinton. Secretary Kerry had different priorities, especially Middle East peace agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, agreement with Russia on Syria. It was sort of up and down under Secretaries Tillerson and Pompeo. And so it was really had to do with what events were going on in the world and what the personal priorities of different policymakers were at the time. So when you put it all together, those are the reasons why the pivot did not accomplish more than it did.
Indeed, and you both offer a half dozen reasons why the pivot was never quite executed well, including there was a lack of a catalytic event in Asia. Right, exactly. If perhaps we had had a dust-up over Taiwan that led to a real conflict, this would be a different book.
Yeah, well, so on this notion of this, as Bob was saying, this is an attempt to shift our grand strategy as a country to put Asia as a priority, rather than, at least implicitly, we'd always been a Europe first nation. This is true even during World War II after Pearl Harbor, and we were explicitly Europe first. And if you look at grand strategic shifts in the past course of U.S. foreign policy, it's taken some major catalytic event, usually a violent catalytic event, in order to do this. 9/11 birthed the war on terror. The invasion of South Korea sort of changed the tenor of the Cold War and sparked the Korean War. Pearl Harbor, sort of knocked us out of whatever residual isolationism there was. And so the pivot was a way of trying to create a shift like that in the absence of some catalytic event, and in some ways to avoid that catalytic event by not having to go to war against China to produce this or something like that, but actually to be able to deter this. And so it does raise the questions about how well a democracy like ours can shift in response to strategic thought and hopefully wisdom as opposed to crisis. And so, we're getting there, but.
No, and one of the great things about this book is that you don't just stop at reviewing and analyzing U.S. policy. You offer your own strategic principles. You actually come down with these are the 5 vital interests, and you've talked about the nub of that, the sort of crux of that interest being to prevent China from overturning the regional and global order. So, Bob, if I can turn back to you in terms of how did you think about the strategic framework that you imposed on this book? Because You've been in the White House. You've been in policy business for a long time. You've managed to crystallize a strategy. Why have we failed to do this? What you're recommending, but how did you come down to that as the vital interest in terms of not?
Well, what Richard and I have noticed, and Patrick, you know this very well too, is that if you look at opinion pieces day by day by day, they're full of prescriptions, some wise, some perhaps not so wise, but in any case, the connection between the prescriptions and vital national interests is almost never exposed or discussed. So early in the book, we catalog what we think are the 5 vital national interests, and then we connect them to the rise of Chinese power, and we demonstrate that China now has the capacity and clearly the intent to challenge all of American vital national interests. They're further along in some than others, but they clearly have that as an intent, and that gives me the bridge to say just 3 more reasons that the pivot failed, that there was a lost decade in which the United States did not respond adequately to the rise of Chinese power. And those centered on first, and you've implied this already, that we persistently underestimated the China challenge until late in the 2010s. Second, there was a very weak interagency process and all government preparation to deploy this extraordinary initiative. And I can report that without, I think, any doubt, any challenge, that this initiative was based on no consultation with our friends or our allies. They first, most of them learned about it in the foreign policy article by Secretary Clinton. They rushed in, of course, as ambassadors are paid to do, to say, what is this? Tell us more. And the administration was unprepared to tell them what this meant, what it meant for Europe, what it meant for the Middle East, what would such a pivot produce for these other regions, and so forth. And so there was great anxiety in Europe after the announcement. Does this mean that the United States is no longer going to defend Europe through Article 5? In the Middle East, it propelled forward a view that was already gaining momentum, which was the United States is going home. And then finally, no American president during this period, we're now close to 15 years of it, has put his, and it's always been his shoulder against the wheel to push it forward. And as we know, if there is a big idea, the response to 9/11, for example, that particular president, as we know, spoke about the challenge and his determination to meet it almost every day. Well, no American president has yet given a speech about shifting to Asia, even though we progressively had a consensus in the US that we should.
Indeed. And some of us have watched that over the years, wondering, being puzzled by why the White House is reluctant to do that. You offer in 3 middle chapters in this book 3 ways that we might be able to harness greater influence and power when you talk about what we do with Europe, the Middle East, and in the Indo-Pacific itself. And I wonder if we can just take each one of those regions separately and talk a bit about Europe. First, this is a historic shift of more than 200 years, as you point out in the book, to try to shift and pivot from Europe to Asia. At a time when you've got rightist forces in France about to win an election potentially, and Putin thinking maybe that he can win this war in Ukraine, is this an easy time to expect that opportunity for Europe to do more? Or how do you view Europe right at this moment in light of what you've written, which is a very compelling argument in general, but is this the moment for Europe to watch the U.S. shift resources to Asia? Or how do we straddle Europe at this moment, given the fact that we're trying to execute a serious pivot toward Asia-Pacific? And either one of you.
Sure. Well, I'll take a stab. I think the first thing to say is what we don't think one should do, which sometimes you can hear in policy circles, which is essentially leave Europe to the Europeans, leave Ukraine to the Europeans, sort of let the friendly locals get stronger and sort things out themselves, because we've got bigger issues to deal with in Asia, and it's a big distraction. That is too blunt a notion of pivoting to Asia. The United States remains a global power and has vital national interests in Asia for sure, but also in Europe and the Middle East, and commitments there as well. And of course, these regions are interlinked. So for example, if the United States were to just decide, despite everything we've said about how long we will stay with Ukraine and how long we will oppose what Russia has done, that we just sort of changed our mind and got tired of it, then certainly that would be a signal to both allies and potential adversaries and would-be aggressors in Asia. So these things are linked, and we have to think about these things as linked. That said, if you look at what is happening in Europe, each of these countries in military terms is getting stronger than was the case before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I believe it wasn't not that many years ago, there was something like 3 NATO members that were 2% of GDP in defense spending. By the end of this year, it's supposed to be 18 or 20 or a much bigger number. Now the catalyst obviously has been the shock of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but they're getting stronger and better able to defend themselves, still with U.S. help. I think the Europeans are especially important on the non-military side when it comes to Asia. So yes, there can be the redeployment, for example, of some maritime and air assets, U.S. from Europe to Asia, so as to better balance the military assets out in the Indo-Pacific. But Europe is especially important on the technology and the economic side. I mean, much of the competition with China takes place in those areas, and we need Europe on our side, whether you think about semiconductors and export controls on those, or the production of military other technologies. We need the Europeans, and so that's really where the U.S. and Europe need to come together and sort of pursue this strategy with respect to China and Asia.
And indeed, that's
Could I just chime in on that, Patrick?
Yes.
On Europe, and simply say, in addition to what Richard just said, is that we don't believe there is a serious danger of Putin challenging Article 5 by invading a NATO country. First of all, this is not the Red Army that we are facing here, and it's been weakened, at least to some degree, by the war in Ukraine, certainly through manpower numbers and armored numbers and so forth. So we think that deterrence of Russia regarding west toward Europe can be maintained while we shift those assets that Richard mentioned, air and maritime, to Asia. But, and this is a point that we stress throughout the book, of course, in doing that, we would have to have quality diplomacy. And the 2010s is not an exemplary decade for quality U.S. diplomacy. I could go through, the book goes through examples in Asia, examples in Europe, examples in the Middle East. But in all three of those regions, at the end of the lost decade, the 2010s, our reputation for effective and resolute and sustained diplomacy was close to rock bottom. And the Biden administration, we think, has improved that situation to some extent, but not to put all those concerns in Europe to the side. So we could make the biggest mistake is the one we could make that Richard has already adverted to, which is to conclude that Asia, China is so important that we should withdraw our support, end our support to Ukraine. That would be a catastrophic diplomatic and security error, Richard and I believe.
No, and I think your book makes very clear you're trying to argue a very complex, sophisticated argument that it's not just one instrument of power, it's how you use all your instruments together. We could spend a lot more on military and not be effective. We could spend less and be in trouble or not. But let me just turn to the Middle East on that question, because again, we've got another war going on in the Middle East as well. So you talk about there was an assumption of a quiescent Europe. Maybe there was an assumption of a Middle East that was not going to at least escalate beyond what we've seen before, but we do have this conflict going on. And you try to put forward, I think, an argument of we can reduce the U.S. footprint in the Middle East, but we have to be ready to respond when our core interests are threatened. So how does that play out in light of, again, current events in the Middle East?
Yeah, this is one of the things that was at least perplexing to me over the years, because if one travels to the Middle East or talks to senior officials there from almost any country, for more than a decade now, it's been an absolute article of faith that the United States has gone home, is going home, or will go home. Those sort of shift. And you say, well, where is this withdrawal? We still have the 5 air bases. We still have the 5th Fleet in Bahrain. We still have troops all over the place. We still have our security partnerships. We still have troops in Kuwait. So where is this withdrawal? And of course, if you look at the actual numbers of troops, for example, which we do, those numbers have barely shifted since 2011 when the pivot to Asia was announced. And what you really find is that people there are not so much talking about the actual footprint, the actual presence, how many planes we have there, how many ships are in what sea, how many troops we have on the ground. They're talking about performance. They're talking about at least what they see as the fulfillment of our commitments or lack thereof. And of course, our performance has been all over the place. We don't want to get into things in terms of wars and violated red lines, and then sometimes we do, and then and all of this. And of course, all of the body language of American presidents, whether it was Obama or Trump or at least at the beginning, Joe Biden, is that we've squandered so much time and resources in the sands of the Middle East that we need to pull back and get out of there. And so it's our contention that if we perform more consistently, we fulfill our commitments more consistently, and we play a stabilizing role more consistently, we can actually do that with less military resources that we have today, because really the total amount of resources that happens to be in the CENTCOM AR at any particular time is not the issue.
You also then argue not just that we should be able to shift some resources from Europe and from the Middle East, but also that we could be better leaders of Asia-Pacific allies and partners. And I want to turn to you, Bob, and just ask specifically about India, because you were present at I think a pivotal moment when you really improved the relationship, shifted in this century with India and the U.S. relationship. And yet at the same time, how far can that relationship go? So when you talk about in your chapter 9 on improving leadership in Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, when you think about a big country like India, much has happened, and you're to be credited with some of the success of that happening, both of you. But how far can we really bring India into that? Because at the end you refer to the critical allies and you include India in that list, but India, of course, is famously not aligned.
Well, there's what India says, and then there's what India does. And one of, and there are probably a few, but one of the consistent through administrations policies have been to strengthen U.S. ties with India. And the same has been true in the administrations, the two administrations in India. And Modi, of course, having finished his second term and won his third. And I think this is very likely to continue, and it will continue largely off the front pages. The Indians don't want to overemphasize their relationship, especially on the security side with the United States, but it continues week, month, year to become more robust. And of course, the reason is this astonishing growth in Chinese power. There's one other point I'll make, which is ironic and almost amusing. The Indians have concluded that their regional preoccupations of the past have been overtaken by globalization and the reality that decisions are made far from South Asia that deeply affect South Asia. So at a time when some American strategists are recommending that America become a regional power, concentrating almost entirely on Asia, the Indians are going exactly in the opposite direction. And they're right, and these critics of our commitments in Europe and the Middle East are wrong.
Well spotted. Richard, I want to then ask you about some of the other allies in the Indo-Pacific that we could be even doing more with. I mean, it's incredible the progress of AUKUS and US, Japan, South Korea trilateral and all the other many-laterals. Much of that work we've done at CNAS in the 2010s when maybe policymakers weren't quite acting on them, but the ideas were there. What else do you think is possible to do in terms of harnessing and orchestrating cooperation with other Indo-Pacific allies and partners?
Yeah, well, Patrick, you've been writing about this for years, including in the 2010s, the networking of security partnerships that the United States has used to augment its 5 treaty alliances. The fact that the United States has been working together more closely with India and Vietnam and other non-allied countries, and then those countries are working together more closely, sometimes with the United States and sometimes not. So there's several things, and you're seeing progress in a number of areas. For example, base access in the Philippines, which is relatively new, and that's kind of a breakthrough given where relations with the Philippines have been over the years. AUKUS, Japan will join in so-called Pillar 2 on the advanced capabilities pillar of AUKUS, which is all to the good. New Zealand seems like it's interested in joining as well, and that could be a platform for other countries to plug in on the defense technology sharing element of AUKUS apart from the subs. With Vietnam, with Indonesia, with Singapore, there are other steps we can take on security. The one sort of gaping hole that we have in our relationships in Asia, of course, is on the economic side. We don't have a trade policy. There's 2 pan-regional trade agreements in Asia. Of course, there's RCEP and CPTPP. China is party to one and has applied to join the other. The United States is party to neither, nor has anything to offer as an alternative, either bilaterally or multilaterally. And, as Patrick, as you know better than anybody, trade policy, economic policy in Asia matters more than it does in a place like the Middle East. It not only has economic ramifications, but signals engagement and leadership and strategic interest. And that remains kind of the blank space with dealing with our Asian allies.
Indeed. Well, let's just talk about the missing economic strategy that I think many administrations have been trying to grasp what can they put in that space, and they're still looking for it. IPEF doesn't seem to be the answer in terms of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It doesn't have trade access. So if we can get an interest in a trade agreement again for the United States. I just came from Britain, and of course Britain is now a member of this Trans-Pacific Partnership that we helped sort of promote, and we're not anywhere near it. But we don't seem to be politically anywhere close to this. So is this an idea that works well in Washington, but is hard to sell in Middle America? And where is our trade policy going?
I'm going to say one thing, and then I know Bob will want to come in on this. First of all, you'll have, no matter who wins the election, you'll have presidents in their second term. Now, I think both President Trump and President Biden have particular core beliefs on trade that don't always militate in the direction of a full-throated embrace. However, they will be politically freer than presidents typically are in their first terms, especially Democratic presidents, if you look at the history, to pursue trade agreements. In a strange way, I have this notion that, President Trump, if he is reelected, could do with TPP something what he did with USMCA and just sort of make some cosmetic changes and tell everyone that, it's all good now, and then he got that thing to Congress. But look, if TPP or CPTPP membership is a bridge too far politically, which it probably is right now, the answer is not to pursue nothing. You could have a U.S.-Taiwan free trade agreement. You could have sectoral agreements in various areas, either bilaterally, multilaterally, or a great first step, and something that has been sort of considered off and on over the months, is a digital trade agreement that wouldn't get at the kind of very politically sensitive sectors like agriculture and autos and things like that, but rather would be more about shaping the rules in which digital trade takes place, and our vision of those rules is very different than China's. And you could do that bilaterally with countries like Singapore or somewhere else, or you could do a multilateral one. So there's a number of options if we deem full-throated re-embrace of TPP too politically difficult.
And of course, there's beyond trade, the issue of industrial policy, if you will. You've advocated in this book for more de-risking, not decoupling, but you do recognize the need for some selective competition there. But I don't know where exactly you might draw the line, given the fact that we are, I think, on a bipartisan fashion these days, moving toward more industrial policy in areas of critical high technology that compete with China. But Bob, what do you think?
Well, you have it exactly right. The momentum, and we support this, is to ensure that the majestic American capacity to invent technologies for military purposes, but more generally for its citizens, not be stolen or actually traded away to China. And that has happened, it happened throughout the lost decade. And so we applaud the Biden administration and the Congress moving in that direction. But with respect to that China economic challenge, almost every nation in Asia during the 2010s became ever more dependent on trade with China. And part of that was because of the failure of the TPP. Now, China is always going to have, of course, a geographic advantage and an advantage of size and economic muscle. But there are strategic consequences of no trade policy. And I think, Patrick, you've also found this, when one travels in Asia, one of the very first questions one gets is,
we were just in suspense
Yes,
to find out what that question is. So, Bob,
and now we can't find it. It's absent. And there's no quick, pithy answer to that, of course.
Bob, can you repeat the question? Your image froze here in the room, I'm afraid, just when you were about to ask, what is the pivotal question?
Well, the pivotal question is that will the United States, through a consensus, at least a necessary congressional consensus, and led by the president, finally establish a trade policy toward Asia, because we have none now. And it is a very large strategic liability for the United States in Asia not to have a trade policy.
Well, that was worth repeating. That's such an important point, because you're right. I mean, that's what you hear in Asia, and you will not hear it in Washington the way you do it in Asia. I do want to switch, though, to the other instrument, another instrument, and that's the defense side, because you're also recommending more defense, and this is happening at a time when there's a discussion about a generational investment in defense and recapitalization. You also have that tremendous, among the graphics in this book, there's the one that stood out in my mind is the bar graph of just the PLA Navy versus the U.S. Navy in 5-year increments from 2000 to 2030. You can just see U.S. leads, U.S. leads, U.S. leads, U.S. dips, U.S. fails, U.S. fails. And it's just a graphic illustration of the power transition and how we've sort of allowed that to happen. And even if we can disagree over, we can debate the value of numbers of ships, that graphic still speaks a big truth. And Richard, what do you think about the defense side of what we're doing right now in Asia Pacific, and what you're both recommending in this book to strengthen that posture in the region?
Yeah, so you're right. If you look, I mean, obviously the Indo-Pacific is a primarily air and maritime domain in terms of defense. Over the years that we're describing and beyond, the Chinese Navy has really expanded significantly, and the American Navy has actually shrunk. So we have fewer ships now than we had some years ago. You net that out, and so about 20 years ago, the U.S. had about 150 more ships than China did. That number shrank to 0, and in the next couple of years, China will have about 150 more ships than the United States. So yes, you can quibble about tonnage and missile tubes and all these other things, but there's a certain quantity out there that does point or illustrate the direction that things have been going. So what do you do about this? We talked a little bit earlier about the ability to redeploy some air and naval assets from the Middle East and from Europe to the Indo-Pacific on a more regular basis, and they could surge back into those regions as necessary, as they have done with the war in Gaza, but to increase deterrence and start to chip away at the military balance in the Indo-Pacific, which has been shifting away from the United States and its allies and toward China. But that's not enough. You have to grow the overall defense pie. So right now we're at about 3% of GDP spending on defense, which matches the spending level in 1999, which was the height of the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. It's also about where we were in 1953 after we wrapped up the Korean War, and again tried to get a peace dividend there. There's no peace dividend to be had now. I mean, obviously there are raging wars in Europe and the Middle East. There's a very significant demand on U.S. defense resources, and then we have the challenge we're talking about with China and the Indo-Pacific. So you need a significant increase in overall defense resources. The defense budget the administration turned in for this year actually is a real decrease compared to last year, although I think Congress is going to get involved in that. So you need to have a larger amount of overall defense resources and then a greater share of those resources for the Indo-Pacific, and then encourage our allies to do more as they are. I mean, other than China's rise, it seems to me that the most significant thing happening in Asian security now is the growth of Japan's defense capabilities, the doubling of its budget over 5 years. If it fulfills its commitments, which it looks like it will, Japan will have the 3rd biggest defense budget in the world, which is amazing. Bigger than India, bigger than Russia, and acquiring the kind of capabilities that it didn't previously have. And so, working together more closely with our allies as they become stronger, encouraging them to do that, and becoming stronger ourselves in the region, I think is the way to go.
And this, of course, strengthens deterrence, which has been weakened over this nearly decade and a half. One is reminded of what Secretary of Defense Harold Brown said during the Soviet period. He said, when we build, they build, and when we don't build, they build. And that's what's been happening with respect to the U.S.-China military balance. And that has to be corrected. And there, of course, is a lively debate going on in Washington and elsewhere about Taiwan and the danger of a Chinese attack on Taiwan, and whether the United States should more or less automatically go to Taiwan's military assistance and so forth. But this depends largely on deterrence and whether, from the Chinese point of view, this is going to be so hard to do, given the strong deterrence throughout Asia, the United States and its allies, that not today. We won't do it today. And that's, of course, what deterrence rests on. So this budget, the military budget, we salute the fact that it looks as if the Congress is going to substantially increase it, because that needs to be done.
And, another argument you make in the book that's very compelling to me is the need to make these critical trade-offs. So with the critical trade-off on Taiwan defense spending, just to sort of focus on that one issue, and this comes up in the review that just came out from Oriana Mastro, a positive review of your book in Foreign Affairs issue that just came out today. But she talks about, on Taiwan, the debate being between, of course, the readiness for that deterrence today versus the longer-term modernization competition to kind of be ready for the future challenge that China may pose. So do you have an answer for that? Where do you slice this in half? Where do you slice the budget? Where do you put your priorities right now or on the future, or do you mix it 50-50, or what's your balance?
Yeah, so we don't get too much into how we should allocate defense resources versus F-35s flying off of carriers versus something else in the region, although that's obviously a major debate and critical in order to maximize deterrence and maximize the value that our defense dollars get out there. So just speaking for myself, however, I think some of the steps that DoD is moving in the direction of are the right ones, like the replicator program, which is going to field tens of thousands of drones and sort of autonomous systems, advances in, I think AUKUS, yes, we have to wait 10 years plus to get the subs, but when we're out there, rather have the subs than not, right? That's a very effective capability to put resources against. So increasing the amount of resources that are going into submarine production, shipbuilding, unmanned and autonomous systems, especially swarming concepts of large numbers of attritable systems and missiles, long-range and medium-range fires, to me are the areas that we would want to look at. And now we have some options in terms of geography that weren't available even a few years ago in order to put things in different places. So that's where I would come down.
But Bob, on the political judgment, though, on Taiwan, if you're in the White House and you're trying to judge whether something is going to be provocative to Beijing, for instance, I think Robert O'Brien recommends in the same issue of Foreign Affairs that Taiwan ought to be invited to the RIMPAC biannual naval exercises. Maybe that would not be such a big provocation, but one can imagine undertaking more aggressive, assertive support for Taiwan, somehow at some point triggering a harsher Chinese response. So how do you think about the political calculus of what the Chinese will respond to when we try to protect Taiwan and the status quo?
Well, first, I think one needs to say that a war between the United States and China over Taiwan would be a global catastrophe. So one begins there, and deterrence is a big part of trying to prevent that from happening. I think, unfortunately, what is occurring now is a lack of restraint by both countries, which is not consistent with the one China policy that kept peace across the straits for half a century. China is increasingly increasing the military pressure on Taiwan. It grows every month. And the United States is the administration under the urging of both sides of the aisle in the Congress has strengthened all three dimensions of our bilateral relationship. with Taiwan. Henry Kissinger, to almost his last day, worried that if the two countries keep on the track they're on and show too little restraint with respect to their actions regarding Taiwan, that there will be a war between the United States and China. And it isn't clear that there's any effective diplomacy going on between the two sides regarding Taiwan. They get together and they discuss Taiwan, and the Chinese side goes through its previous talking points, and the U.S. side goes through its previous talking points. But I don't think, at least it isn't apparent, that after each one of these discussions, and good that they're having them, that one objectively could say, well, that discussion lessened the likelihood of a war.
That is indeed the conundrum here on, how do we gauge China? War would be catastrophic, but as you point out, in your vital interest, we're trying to block China from upending the order. And seizing Taiwan through force would certainly change the order in both the region and the globe. So this is the imponderable challenge that every policymaker has to face on these issues here. I just want to go a little bit deeper in your thinking about China's strategy and just step back a bit, because you do argue in a separate chapter about the basic goal of Chinese leaders is to, not to put too fine a point on it, replace the United States as the most influential power in both the Indo-Pacific and maybe globally. And I'm wondering how you have diplomacy and a policy of deterrence that matches that goal, because it goes back to your point about Harold Brown, Ambassador Blackwill, that this is what China's doing too. And you write it in the book, you say whether we have a pivot or not, China's going to keep pressing on this. This is their strategy, and they're sticking to it. So how do we get effective diplomacy with a country that has that expansive goal, which, as you point out, connects the rejuvenation of China with being a great power, and it does that explicitly. So that's the goal. You have a chapter on transnational diplomacy and issues from climate change to pandemics, and you'd say these are issues we ought to be able to cooperate on, but it's not been very effective yet, and it's not likely to get more effective, unfortunately. So where do we get the effective traction on diplomacy with China?
Well, I guess I would say we have to strengthen deterrence and our capabilities, our power projection, in order to give China incentives to be more collaborative, cooperative. We're afraid that the evidence that's in great detail in the book demonstrates that the leadership of China does believe that America's in permanent strategic decline. And that's affecting their decision making and will continue to affect it. And they are also, of course, close observers of our domestic chaos and problematical future. So in the political side. So we have, it's important, we think, to stress that there's no reason to be strategically pessimistic about America and its allies' capacity to deal effectively with the rise of Chinese power. But we have to now go beyond our rhetoric, which is largely agreed that China is trying to do exactly what you just said, Patrick. But now our rhetoric has to be followed by sustained and powerful actions. And that's the best way to avoid this war. That's a very Reagan-esque formula, but it's right.
And you offer, strategic guideposts as well as a to-do list of maybe 9 or 10 items, depending on whether America adjusting to being a Pacific power is the 10th item. I think the you talk about a positive vision, global leadership, making tough trade-offs, and having the unity to compete with China being these principles that would help guide a strategy that could compete better and execute a successful pivot. But in your mind, even if we did everything on your to-do list, given China's power and their intentions, is it enough? I mean, what does that give us in 10 or 20 years? Does it give us a slower decline of influence in the region, equal influence in the region, greater influence in the region? Where do you think? I mean, how optimistic are you that this strategy, this grand strategy, can produce the results that we'd like to see?
I'm optimistic. I should say, and we try to say this in the book, that even if the United States had pivoted to Asia as intended all the way back in the 2011 timeframe, we'd still have a major China challenge on our hands. It's not, the pivot then, the pivot now is not a magical elixir, in part because there's no such thing as a magical elixir, right? So it's not going to eliminate the challenge that we face. It would just make us better able to deal with it, right? So if we do the things that we are suggesting in terms of some of the recommendations you said, we would increase deterrence and reduce the likelihood of war without capitulation. Would we eliminate it to zero? No, but we would reduce it. You know, if we had a trade policy, you could mitigate at least to some degree some of the economic dominance that China has in terms of trade relations with some of the countries. You won't eliminate it for sure, given the economic scale of that country and so forth. But it would be better. We'd be better able, and our allies and friends would be better able to deal with it. So if you do all the things that we said, I think we will face an indefinite China challenge. But overall, the large goal here is to ensure that China is unable to upend the regional order and the global order, either unable or unwilling to do so without going to war to stop them. And that, I think, is an achievable objective.
It perhaps is the moment to say that achievable objective requires the United States working with its allies and successfully and in a sustained way. And some of the debate in Washington ignores the crucial role of allies as we deal with this momentous Chinese capacity, which has grown over the last 15 years. So when U.S. experts prescribe regime change as a definition of victory over China, no Asian ally or friend will subscribe to that. None. We'd be completely alone. What about beginning again to test nuclear weapons? Well, how would the allies react to that? And that would be predictably. Of course, we can't give our allies in Asia or in Europe or in the Middle East a veto over U.S. policy. But when we say, which many experts do say, this is Cold War II and we need to contain China, no Asian country will sign up to that strategy. So as we did in the post-World War II period, we need to work with our allies intensively as we deal with Chinese power. And formulas which automatically distance ourselves from our allies in dealing with China are wholly mistaken.
Well, this is realism, yes, and I understand exactly what you're arguing and why this is a realistic approach with both capital and a lowercase r. What about issues that are still very important that are outside of this grand strategy? I mean, North Korea. We have Putin in North Korea right now. That's a troublesome growing defense partnership because they can be more than spoilers. They can be extreme disruptors, I think. Even you can imagine a tactical nuclear weapon being used in the future. So how do you think about, what Russia's doing in Asia, but also North Korea's growth, or Iran, or other issues that are still very pressing on U.S. interests?
Yeah, so my colleague, Andrea Kendall-Taylor, and I wrote an article for Foreign Affairs on what we call the axis of upheaval. There seem to be 30 or 40 different terms for the new collaboration among Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, but that's the one that we picked. But whatever you call this, it's new, it's closer than it has been previously. And Putin, as you said, is in North Korea for the first time in 24 years or something like this. North Korea has supplied millions of rounds of ammunition to Russia. Iran has supplied drones. It's still a little unclear exactly what Russia is supplying to Iran and North Korea, and specifically in the way of military technology, but whatever it is not going to be good. What this does, and of course then there's the China aspect of this. China is supplying parts to the Russian war machine, and so it makes each of these four countries more dangerous to us and to our allies and friends than they would be on their own. So Russia is able to fire Iranian, North Korean, and Russian weapons with Chinese parts at Ukrainians rather than just what they had before. North Korea will have some advantage, whether that's in missile technology or space launch or whatever it is, and so forth. So it makes each of them more dangerous. It also dilutes the efficacy of some of our traditional tools of foreign policy. I mean, these four countries are glued together by opposition to what they see as a anachronistic Western-dominated international order. It doesn't give them their sphere of influence and their status and their weight and all of that. But also, for example, opposition to U.S. sanctions, and they want to find mechanisms by which they can avoid and circumvent those sanctions. So, and then, of course, you have things that previously were thinkable, but now that aren't, right? So not that many years ago that the P5+1 got together and tried to put sanctions in place on Iran to bring it to the negotiating table over its nuclear program. The idea that Russia, China, the United States, and anyone else would get together collectively to pressure Iran now to come back to the table is just unthinkable. I mean, Iran and China and Russia are working together, not at cross purposes. Similarly on North Korea, if you go back even further, it was the six-party talks that include both China and Russia. And again, the objective was, can you get some sort of denuclearization deal with North Korea? Again, unthinkable now. I mean, they're collaborators, not in any way seeking to isolate North Korea or something like that. So what do you do about it? Some of the things that we suggest in the book, I think, can have broader application to this phenomenon, which you're seeing. Increased defense resources, working together more closely with allies and partners, having an offensive economic strategy, de-risking, things like that. But increasingly, the phenomenon of these countries working together is going to have to be incorporated into how we think about U.S. activities writ large, but also demonstrates, for example, why events in Europe matter for events in Asia and vice versa, rather than just seeing these things in isolation.
I mean, one of the things that occurs to me, of course, is just the enormity of the global challenge that the United States faces right now. It's
Exactly.
bigger than China, in fact. So what gives you both hope right now in a time that we're highly polarized politically in this country? We don't have quite the unity that you're calling for, but we need to get there. How do we get to that greater unity? What gives you the optimism that we can achieve our potential here in this 21st century, given the rise of the Asia-Pacific? And maybe just as a final...
Lee Kuan Yew once said to me that the biggest mistake that foreign countries made about the United States was to underestimate its resiliency and its capacity to correct earlier mistakes. He also said there were plenty of those. So we're not genetically incompetent in our diplomacy. I don't think people would come to that conclusion, but it has to be better. And then it's up to the whoever is president in 2025 to think his way through these challenges and to bring the country together behind the consensus that exists that China is a generational challenge that seeks to upend the global order that has been so good to the United States and to the West, and indeed to China. And there is a more or less consensus about that in the United States now. But as I said earlier, we have to go beyond the words to the acts. And again, as I said, this will test our seriousness as a country. Because if we don't follow the prescriptions that Richard and I lay out, and including the one that you just mentioned, Patrick, about domestic division and turmoil, then we will become weaker and China will become stronger. And their capacity to overturn the world order at the expense of the United States and all of its citizens will increase. So we need to act.
Yeah, I would just say I'm optimistic for reasons of history and fundamental drivers of national power. So if you look at history, each time it's looked like the world is filled with trouble and the United States is sort of on its back foot, there's been, sort of the re-rise of the United States. You can look to pick whatever you want, Sputnik or Vietnam or sort of the Carter malaise and all the stuff that happened in 1979, or the nadir of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan simultaneously and how overwhelmed and divided the United States was. So this time could be different, but we've got a lot of historical evidence to suggest that our, as Bob said, our error correction mechanism is real, but so is our internal resiliency. And so I think there's optimism to be found in history. But also, if you look at the fundamental drivers, I mean, whose cards would you rather have? China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, or the United States with its geography, its population, its innovation, its economy, its values, its allies? You put all that together, and we have everything we need to be successful in this sort of global competition we're in. It's about whether and how we actually put the things together, and that fundamentally isn't up to China or Russia or anybody else. That's up to us. So,
well, I think you've made a great case for the next pivot to Asia. I hope you succeed. Thank you so much, Ambassador Blackwill and Richard Fontaine. Please join me in thanking our speakers today.
thank you.
Thank you for having us.